I want you to really process what just happened in Washington, D.C. over the last 48 hours. Because if we don't call this out right now, we are going to wake up in a country we don't recognize. We have a situation where a federal judge, Judge Jia Cobb, looked at the Trump administration's military lockdown of our capital city and effectively said, "This is illegal. You cannot do this." She didn't stutter. She ruled that turning the National Guard into a private police force for the president is an unlawful military occupation. In a functioning democracy, that is where the story ends. The president grumbles, he tweets, but he pulls the troops back. But that is not what Donald Trump did. Instead, he looked at that court order, saw that he had a temporary 3-week window before it officially kicked in, and decided to drive a tank right through the loophole. He didn't just ignore the ruling, he spat on it. He used a tragic shooting near the White House, a heartbreaking event that should have been about mourning, as a convenient excuse to order 500 additional soldiers into the city. Think about the level of cynicism required to do that. He is taking a tragedy and using it as a shield to violate a court order. He is betting that you will be so scared by the headline about the shooting that you won't notice he is seizing power that the judicial branch just told him he does not have. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth is calling this resolve. He's out there claiming they are securing the city. But let's cut the nonsense. You don't secure a city by breaking the law. You don't protect the Constitution by trampling on the separation of powers. What we are watching is a stress test. Donald Trump is testing the system to see if it has any brakes left. He is seeing if he can simply overwhelm the courts with sheer volume, more troops, more orders, more defiance until the legal system just gives up.
And the most terrifying part? It's happening in plain sight. There's no cover-up. They aren't doing this in the middle of the night. They are doing it on Truth Social in all caps, daring anyone to stop them. If this feels like a crisis, that's because it is. When the executive branch decides that court rulings are just suggestions, the rule of law is effectively over. The administration is banking on the hope that you won't actually read the 61-page opinion issued by Judge Cobb. They are counting on the fact that legal filings are dense, boring, and full of jargon, so they can spin a narrative about law and order that bears absolutely no resemblance to what is happening in the courtroom. But we are going to read it. We are going to look at the specific mechanism they use to hijack the nation's capital. Because when you strip away the bluster, the legal argument Donald Trump's lawyers made is not just weak, it is insulting to your intelligence. The core of Judge Cobb's ruling on November 20th hinges on a specific, obscure section of the D.C. Code, Title 49. Now, normally, the National Guard is a state militia. If there's a riot in Florida, the governor of Florida calls out the Guard. But D.C. is not a state. The D.C. Guard reports to the president. However, that power is not infinite. It's not a blank check. The law lists very specific reasons the president can activate these troops: to suppress an insurrection, to repel an invasion, or, and this is the kicker, to aid civil authorities on request. Here is the problem for Donald Trump. D.C. did not ask for this. In fact, D.C. Mayor Muriel Bowser and Attorney General Brian Schwab didn't just fail to ask, they actively sued to stop it. They went to court and said, "We do not want these soldiers here. They are disrupting our city. They are hurting our businesses. Please make them leave."
So, with the aid to civil authorities path blocked, and with no actual insurrection happening, the Trump legal team justified keeping 2,000 soldiers on the streets for months. They claimed it was a training exercise. I want you to really sit with that. They walked into a federal court and argued with a straight face that thousands of fully armed soldiers patrolling street corners, setting up checkpoints, and detaining civilians were merely engaged in a, quote, drill. They pointed to a statute that allows the Guard to gather for parades and encampments, and tried to tell a federal judge that an indefinite military occupation of a major American city is legally the same thing as a 4th of July parade. Judge Cobb wasn't buying it. She tore this argument apart limb from limb. She wrote that accepting the administration's logic would grant the president expansive authority that Congress clearly never intended. She pointed out the obvious. Congress would not bury the power to impose martial law inside a chapter about ceremonial drills. She ruled that the deployment was likely unlawful because the president was using the Guard for police work, specifically crime deterrence, without the necessary statutory authorization. That was the ruling. It was clear. It was precise. It was a stop sign. But here is where the dictator-style governance kicks in. Judge Cobb, adhering to standard judicial procedure, issued a stay of her own order for 21 days. This is a routine professional courtesy. It allows the losing side, in this case the Trump administration, time to file an appeal before they have to scramble to move thousands of troops. It is meant to prevent logistical chaos, not to provide a window for escalation. Donald Trump looked at that 21-day courtesy and saw a loophole. He realized that for 3 weeks, the order to leave was technically paused. So instead of preparing to withdraw, he decided to double down. Then came Wednesday, November 26th. We saw the tragic shooting of 2 National Guard members near the White House. One soldier, Specialist Sarah Beckstrom, lost her life. It was a horrific act of violence, and the suspect, Ramanullah Lakanwal, was apprehended. In a normal world, the response to this would be an investigation. You look at the security protocols, you mourn the loss, you ask why these soldiers were put in a vulnerable position to begin with. But the Trump administration didn't wait for the facts. They didn't wait for a threat assessment. Within hours, Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth, operating remotely from the Dominican Republic, which tells you everything you need to know about how seriously they take the chain of command, announced that the president had ordered 500 additional National Guard troops to deploy to D.C. immediately. Do not miss the sleight of hand here. They are using the violence against the troops to justify sending more troops. This is a circular logic that would be laughable if it weren't so dangerous. The judge ruled that the troops shouldn't be there because they are performing unauthorized police duties. Trump keeps them there. A tragedy occurs involving those troops. Trump uses that tragedy to argue that he needs more troops to perform the very police duties the judge just said were illegal. He is arguing that the unlawful occupation must expand to protect the unlawful occupation. And notice the justification they're using publicly. They're shouting about a crime emergency in Washington, D.C. They're painting a picture of a city on fire, a war zone that only the military can pacify. But let's look at the numbers, because the facts are stubborn things. Before Trump flooded the zone with camo and Humvees, violent crime in D.C. was actually down. Homicides had dropped. Carjackings had plummeted. The Metropolitan Police Department, the actual civilian police force, was doing its job.
When Judge Cobb asked the Trump administration for evidence, any evidence that the military presence was necessary to stop a crime wave, do you know what they produced? Nothing. They couldn't show a correlation. They couldn't prove necessity, because this isn't about crime. If it were about crime, they would be funding the police. They would be coordinating with local detectives. They wouldn't be importing soldiers from West Virginia and Tennessee who don't know the streets, don't know the community, and have no police powers to make arrests. This is what makes the forensic look at this so damning. When you strip away the Fox News banners, you are left with a president who is spending millions of taxpayer dollars to station soldiers in a city that doesn't want them, to solve a problem that doesn't exist, using a legal authority he doesn't have. And let's touch on the interstate aspect of this, because this is the other half of the scam. Trump isn't just using the D.C. Guard. He is flying in National Guard units from red state allies. Governors who are desperate to kiss the ring are shipping their own citizens to D.C. as political props. Judge Cobb's ruling addressed this too. She looked at 32 U.S.C. 502, the law governing these types of interstate deployments. She found that without a valid training purpose, and again, patrolling D.C. is not training, there is no statutory basis for these out-of-state troops to be operating as a federal police force. So every single soldier currently standing on a corner in downtown D.C. from Florida or Tennessee or Texas is there on legally shaky ground. They're being used, they're being put in harm's way, not to defend the Constitution, but to defend Donald Trump's vanity. And what is the administration's response to all of this legal clarity? Defiance.
Absolute, unmitigated defiance.
They filed an appeal, sure, but their actions on the ground speak louder than their filings. By ordering these 500 new troops, Trump is signaling that he does not intend to comply with the December 11th deadline. He is creating a fact on the ground. He is calculating that if he puts enough bodies in the street, the courts will be too terrified to enforce their own orders. He is daring the judicial branch to escalate. He is daring the Supreme Court to intervene. This is a strategy of overwhelm. It is the same strategy he uses in every aspect of his life. Flood the zone with chaos, break so many norms so quickly that the system jams up trying to process it all. While we are arguing about the 500 new troops, we forget about the initial 2,000. While we argue about the shooting, we forget about the ruling. It is a shell game, and the prize underneath the shell is the integrity of the United States Constitution. And I want to point out one more specific detail from the court documents that really exposes the malice here. In the filings, the D.C. government noted that the presence of these troops was actually impeding local law enforcement. You have soldiers blocking traffic. You have confused chains of command. You have a militarized atmosphere that escalates tensions with the community rather than de-escalating them. The experts, the actual police chiefs and the attorney general are saying, you are making this worse. And Trump's response? Send more. He doesn't care if it works. He doesn't care if it makes D.C. safer. In fact, chaos helps him. If D.C. feels like a war zone, it justifies his rhetoric. If there is friction between the soldiers and the locals, it fits his narrative of us versus them. He is manufacturing a crisis so he can pose as the savior.
This is why the forensic details matter. Because when you look at the dates, the statutes, and the rulings, you see that there is no legal foundation for any of this. It is a house of cards built on a deliberate misreading of the law. But a house of cards can still do a lot of damage if you refuse to knock it down. And right now, Donald Trump is betting everything that the American people are too distracted to notice that he is building a fortress on a foundation of sand. He thinks he has found the ultimate loophole. If you simply ignore the judge and send the army anyway, who is going to stop you? That is the question that should keep every single one of us awake at night, because we are about to find out the answer. If you are looking at this deployment of 500 troops and thinking it is an isolated incident, a knee-jerk reaction to a specific crime, you are missing the forest for the trees. Because when you zoom out, the picture becomes terrifyingly clear. This is not a glitch in the Trump presidency, this is the architecture. We are witnessing the active normalization of using the American military as a domestic political weapon. This is the culmination of a strategy that has been stress-tested, refined, and telegraphed for years. Go back to June of 2020. We all remember the images. Peaceful protesters in Lafayette Square were tear-gassed, beaten, and forcibly cleared, specifically so Donald Trump could walk across the street and hold a Bible upside down in front of a church he didn't attend. At the time, people focused on the photo op. They focused on the awkwardness of it. But the Trump team took away a very different lesson from that day. They learned that they could deploy federal force against American citizens on American soil, and the system would not stop them. They learned that the visual of dominance, the riot gear, the shields, the smoke, resonated with their base more than the legality of the order mattered to the courts.
That was the beta test. What we are seeing in D.C. right now is the full product launch. Think about the rhetoric we heard all throughout the 2024 campaign. Donald Trump didn't hide his intentions. He screamed them into microphones at every rally. He explicitly promised to invoke the Insurrection Act on day one. He repeatedly referred to Democrat-run cities, not as parts of the United States that needed support, but as enemy territory that needed to be conquered. He told us he would be a dictator on his first day. The media tried to laugh it off. They called it hyperbole. They said, oh, that's just Trump being Trump. He wasn't joking. He was giving us the itinerary. And now, look at who is executing these orders. This is a crucial piece of the puzzle that explains why this is happening now. In his first term, Trump was surrounded by people like General Mark Milley or James Mattis, military institutionalists who, for all their faults, understood the line between the military and the police. They knew that the Posse Comitatus Act exists for a reason, to prevent a president from turning the army into his personal enforcement squad. Those people are gone. They have been purged. In their place, we have Pete Hegseth running the Department of Defense, a man whose primary qualification for running the world's most powerful military was talking about the woke agenda on Fox and Friends. Why put a television host in charge of the Pentagon? Because you don't hire Pete Hegseth to manage complex geopolitical strategy. You hire him because when you say, send 500 troops to D.C. to defy a judge, he doesn't ask, is that legal, Mr. President? He asks, do you want them there by noon?
They have replaced the guardrails with greased skids. They have systematically removed anyone in the chain of command who might prioritize the Constitution over the president's mood. This is the realization of the unitary executive theory that the MAGA legal movement has been pushing for decades. The idea that the president is not just the head of the executive branch, but the entirety of it. In their view, the Department of Justice, the FBI, and the National Guard are not independent institutions with duties to the public. They are extensions of the president's will. So when Judge Cobb says unlawful, they don't see a legal ruling. They see insubordination. And look at how they are treating Washington, D.C. itself. This is critical. They are treating the capital of the United States like it is an occupied zone in a foreign country. Trump calls the shooter an animal and an invader. He uses language designed to dehumanize, to strip away rights, to create a psychological state of war. By framing D.C. as a crime-ridden hellhole that can only be tamed by military force, he is validating a very specific fascist fantasy, that the only thing standing between civilization and chaos is the strongman and his soldiers. It creates a permission structure for his supporters to cheer for the suspension of civil liberties. They look at the troops on the corner and they don't see a violation of the law, they see order. But let's talk about the colossal hypocrisy required to make this argument work. For 50 years, the Republican Party has branded itself as the party of small government. They are the party of states' rights. They are the ones who told us that the federal government is the problem, that local control is sacrosanct. Remember the outrage when the federal government tried to mandate masks? Remember the screaming about tyranny when the EPA tried to regulate coal plants? They told us that Washington, D.C. had no right to tell a local community how to live.
But look at them now. We have a local jurisdiction, the District of Columbia, with its own elected mayor, its own elected council, and its own attorney general. They have all said explicitly and in court, we do not want these federal troops here. And what is the Republican response? Silence. Absolute, deafening silence. Suddenly, local control is out the window. Suddenly, the heavy hand of the federal government is just fine, as long as the boot is on the right neck. Where are the libertarians in the Senate? Where is the don't tread on me crowd? They are cheering for the treading. It exposes their entire political philosophy as a fraud. They don't believe in limited government, they believe in their government. They don't object to tyranny, they just want to be the tyrants. This pattern of behavior, this shifting of the goalposts, is designed to wear you down. It is a psychological war of attrition. They start with 2,000 troops. You get outraged. Then time passes. You get used to seeing the Humvees. It becomes background noise. Then they send 500 more. Maybe you get outraged again, but maybe a little less this time. It is the boiling frog strategy. They are slowly raising the temperature of authoritarianism degree by degree, hoping that by the time the water is boiling, we will be too cooked to jump out of. And they are counting on the complexity of the legal system to bore you into submission. They know that Title 49 of the D.C. Code isn't a sexy headline. They know that administrative stay sounds boring. They use the bureaucracy as camouflage for the coup. But we have to look at the other dominoes that are falling alongside this one. We see the attacks on the civil service, the Schedule F plan to fire nonpartisan experts and replace them with loyalists. We see the threats to defund the Department of Justice if they investigate Trump's allies. We see the absolute refusal of the Speaker of the House to hold the executive accountable.
The deployment in D.C. is not an island. It is a part of a continent of corruption. It fits perfectly into a worldview that sees the law not as a set of rules we all agree to live by, but as a weapon to be wielded against enemies and ignored by friends. This is why they are so dangerous, because they aren't hiding it. They are doing it in the open. They are challenging the very concept of objective reality. When the DC police say crime is down and Trump says crime is up, send the army, he is demanding that you reject the evidence of your eyes and ears. He is demanding that you accept his version of reality as the only truth. And if he wins this stare down with Judge Cobb, if he manages to keep those troops on the street past December 11th, he establishes a new reality. He establishes the precedent that the president can militarize American streets whenever he wants, for as long as he wants, and the courts are powerless to stop him. That is the prize they are chasing. It isn't about safety. It isn't about the 2 soldiers who were tragically shot. It is about power. Absolute, unchallengeable power. And if you think they will stop at D.C., you haven't been paying attention to the power. And D.C. is just the testing ground. It is the laboratory where they refine the tactics they intend to use everywhere else. Which brings us to the most terrifying part of this entire saga. Because once you establish that the military can be used to override local laws and ignore federal judges, where does it end? So where does this end? If you are sitting in Chicago or Philadelphia or Atlanta and you think this is just a DC problem, wake up, because DC is the laboratory. It is the testing ground.
If Donald Trump can successfully defy a federal court order in the nation's capital, if he can maintain an unlawful military occupation under the nose of the Supreme Court and the Congress, then no city is safe. What happens when there is a protest in your city? What happens if there is a labor strike in Michigan? What happens during the next disputed election? If he establishes the precedent that the president can deploy the National Guard without a governor's consent, which is exactly the legal argument he is making right now with these out-of-state troops, then the Posse Comitatus Act is effectively dead. We are staring down the barrel of a federalized police state. This is not hyperbole. This is the logical conclusion of the legal arguments his own lawyers are making in court right now. They are arguing that his power as commander-in-chief overrides local sovereignty. They are arguing that the military answers to him, not the law. And look at the date, December 11th. That is the day the judge's stay expires. That is the day Judge Cobb's order becomes enforceable. That is the day we find out if we are still a nation of laws. If December 11th comes and goes and those troops are still there, or worse, if he sends even more, we are in a full-blown constitutional crisis. At that point, who enforces the law? If the president ignores the court, who makes him stop? The U.S. Marshals? Who do they report to? The Attorney General, who reports to the president. We are looking at a scenario where the executive branch goes fully rogue. And let's not forget the cost. While families are struggling to afford groceries, this administration is burning millions of taxpayer dollars to pay for hotel rooms and per diems for soldiers who are sitting around D.C. doing nothing but serving as props for a photo op. They are wasting your money to fund their cosplay dictatorship.
But they don't care about the waste, because the cruelty is the point. The display of power is the point. Donald Trump is gambling that the American public is too tired to fight back. He is betting that you will shrug and scroll past. He is betting that the media will both sides this into oblivion, framing it as Trump versus the judge instead of Trump versus the Constitution. We cannot let him win that bet. We have to remain vigilant. We have to amplify the voices of the journalists and lawyers exposing this. We have to support D.C. Attorney General Brian Schwab as he fights this in court. Because if we normalize the idea that the president is above the law, we don't have a democracy anymore. We have a kingdom. And I don't know about you, but I didn't vote for a king. I'm Ethan Cole. Don't let them gaslight you.